310 out of every 1,000 assaults are reported to police, which means that 2 out of 3 go unreported. The voices of the survivors have asked everyone, report, keep your voice up.
January 24th, 2018, East Lansing. I watch as Judge Rosemary Aquilina sentences Larry Nassar to 40 to 175 years in prison for sexually assaulting at least 150 minors over multiple decades at my own school, Michigan State University. It's the only thing people are talking about on campus right now. The horror, the disbelief, the powerful victim statements of the brave survivors.
The tables have turned, Larry. We are here. We have our voices, and we are not going anywhere. And now, Larry, it's your turn to listen to me.
The amount of time it went on, the blind eyes of the administration and their lack of comment. As a student at Michigan State University, a woman and a survivor who cares deeply about issues of sexual assault, I followed the lawsuit, sentencing, and the way my university handled it from the beginning. I was absolutely disturbed by how terrible Nassar's actions were, and I was disturbed by the way my university handled the situation and the events that happened afterwards. And I was disturbed by the fact that things seemed so obviously wrong to me, and that wasn't reflected in the way my university responded. Like, how did this go on for so long? How could there not be clear rules for how to effectively prevent this kind of abuse? How did this happen? And it was especially unsettling because it's not like no one was talking about it. We can see that the victims have been talking and reporting and proffering testimony since 1997. They were not silent. In the essay, Tracking Epistemic Violence, Tracking Practices of Silencing by Christy Dotson, Dotson offers a mechanism for understanding how people in marginalized groups can be silenced while giving testimony and shows why this practice of silencing is a form of epistemic violence. So, by using Dotson's mechanism to analyze the responses of many people to the multitude of alleged complaints and allegations against Nassar from 1997 until 2017, the answer to these questions becomes a little bit more clear. They weren't silent. They were silenced. So, identifying practices of silencing with respect to giving testimony is not easy. To do this, Dotson interrogates features of linguistic communication. She points out the power dynamic between the speaker and the audience. The speaker is dependent upon their audience. When a linguistic exchange is successful, it is one of reciprocity, which means that the speaker's electionary acts are successful, which means that the audience understands what the speaker is saying in the way that the speaker intended it to be understood. Or, in Dotson's words, to communicate, we all need an audience willing and capable of hearing us. In order for a speaker to have a successful linguistic exchange, they need to be heard by the audience, which puts the speaker in a vulnerable position, because the audience may not hear the speaker in the way in which the speaker needs them to. Dotson identifies 2 practices of silencing that are based upon different forms of epistemic violence within a testimonial exchange: testimonial smothering and testimonial quieting. By analyzing the Nassar timeline, we can see how these practices of silencing manifest. Testimonial smothering is when the speaker perceives one's immediate audience as unwilling or unable to gain the appropriate uptake of the proffered testimony, which leads the speaker to truncate her own testimony in order to ensure that the testimony contains only content for which one's audience demonstrates testimonial competence.
The next day I went into her office and I just described to her what happened, and that I felt like I had a right to say something, and realizing then that what he did was very wrong. And her response back to me was, before I talked to the police officer, Angela, I needed to make sure that I was doing my research to understand what was happening to me. And just in case I was asked any questions I didn't know, I didn't want to give false information to hurt Larry in any way. So basically what I took out of that is she was still defending Larry.
Dotson identifies multiple situations that are usually present in testimonial smothering. One of the circumstances is that the speaker's testimonial content is unsafe and risky. In Lindsay's testimony, her testimonial content about Nassar's abuse is unsafe and risky because due to many factors like Nassar's high, well-respected position in society, it carries the risk of creating extremely negative effects, so the speaker is pressured to stay quiet about it. Just because the information is risky does not mean that the audience should aid in this practice of silencing. Another circumstance that Dotson identifies is that the audience demonstrates testimonial incompetence with respect to the speaker's testimonial content. Testimonial incompetence is the failure of an audience to demonstrate to the speaker that she or he will find proffered testimony clearly comprehensible and diffusibly intelligible. The audience of the person who proffered testimony about Nassar's abuse, the speaker, demonstrated to the speaker that they were testimonial incompetent because the audience did not meet the conditions of accurate intelligibility with respect to potential testimony on Nassar's abuse. By simply possessing an awareness of some of the negative, skeptical ways people around her view sexual assault allegations, the audience can give the appearance of not being in a position to find the speaker's potential testimony about sexual assault accurately intelligible, which can make speakers reluctant to come forward with testimony. Testimonial quieting is when an audience fails to identify a speaker as a knower. A speaker needs an audience to identify or at least recognize her as a knower in order to offer testimony. We can see testimonial quieting by the way so many people responded to people coming forward about Nassar's abuse.
I was 12 years old when I told my parents, when Larry rubs my feet, he uses his penis. My parents confronted him and he denied any such action. Due to complex details that I won't get into here, my parents chose to believe Larry Nassar over me. To my father, someone who makes such heinous, false accusations is the worst type of person. Every time we got into a fight, he would tell me, "You need to apologize to Larry."
And we can see testimonial quieting manifest in many other ways too. For instance, during rape trials, victims are often asked extremely narrow, pointed questions by the defense attorney as an attempt to make the victim seem less credible or trustworthy. The following extract is from the woman who was raped by ex-Stanford student swimmer Brock Turner. How old are you? How much do you weigh? What did you eat that day? Well, what did you have for dinner? Who made dinner? Did you drink with dinner? No, not even water. When did you drink? How much did you drink? Container did you drink out of? Give you the drink. Do you usually dropped you off at the party time? But where exactly? What were you wearing? Why were you going when you got there? Were you texting? What time did you silent when your sister called? Do you remember silence? On page 53, I'd like to point out that you said it was set to rain. Did you drink? You said you were a party times. Are you sexually? Would you ever cheat? Have a history of cheating? What do you mean? Do you remember the time you woke up anymore from that night? No? Okay. We'll let Brock fill it in. Title IX of the Education Amendments Act of 1972 is a federal law that states, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So less than a week ago, on November 29th, 2018, the Department of Education published a Title IX regulation proposal that consists of new, narrower guidelines that could change the way in which sexual violence allegations are investigated under Title IX of federal civil rights law. Betsy DeVos, Education Secretary, voiced her support for holding universities less accountable and implementing a more balanced approach that focuses on respecting the rights of accused students. This approach comes from a statement from a federal appeals court that argues that universities must allow some form of cross-examination to be compliant with due process rights. In my opinion, allowing the accused to personally cross-examine the accuser in cases involving sexual violence allegations is not the best approach to take. This can be seen from many different sources. It can be seen in cases where the victim is asked extremely narrow, pointed, often irrelevant, and intrusive questions by defense attorneys, like we saw in the Brock Turner case. This is traumatic in itself, but for the victim to be questioned by the person they are accusing of sexual violence would be an entirely different trauma. Dotson writes, to begin a successful dialogue or testimonial exchange on unsafe, potentially damaging testimonial content, speakers may have added demands, and audiences need to meet those demands. In most practices of silencing, the burden of proving the practice of silencing can appear impossible to meet. The understanding of epistemic violence and testimony I have outlined here can aid in identifying practices of silencing by dispersing the burden of proof for proving the existence of practices of silencing between a speaker and an audience, as opposed to the sole burden being placed on the speaker who has been silenced. So, by understanding the many ways that the Nassar survivors failed to have successful linguistic exchanges when proffering testimony, and the extreme harm that resulted from them being silenced, we can think about how these testimonies should have been responded to and how they should be responded to moving forward. Using this line of thought, we can come up with better rules, regulations, and policies. We should think about how universities should handle sexual misconduct in general. Our university should not have been able to get away with handling Nassar in the way that they did for so long, on so many levels. It should have been taken seriously from the first testimony back in '97. There should be policies in place that hold universities more accountable and ensure that there are clear rules for how to respond to these testimonies and handle these cases. Response matters.
Perhaps you have figured it out by now, but little girls don't stay little forever. They grow into strong women that return to destroy your world.